My name is Jamil Haddad. I'm a third-year medical student from Michigan State University, College of Osteopathic Medicine. CMDA is a great opportunity to meet fellow peers, classmates. There are people from all different academic levels here at the conference, and you'll meet them, you'll chat with them, you'll learn how they apply their faith in whatever aspect of their career that they're in, and you'll learn how to apply your faith in the medical career, and you'll learn, very importantly, how to live that Christian life that God has called in advance for you to live. It's been a real privilege to be here, and I'm so looking forward to applying these principles first and foremost when I go back home to Michigan as I continue to live my life, and as I become a resident and attending one day. I look forward to continue to apply all of the things that I learned here.
Hi, this is Dr. Mike Chupp, and you are listening to CMDA Matters, the weekly podcast of the Christian Medical and Dental Associations. I hope you've been enjoying these testimonies of how your CMDA has been transforming the lives of healthcare professionals and students, just like the testimony we heard from Jamil. Each time I speak at CMDA conferences or visit campus and area ministries, I get to hear stories just like these. Honestly, I find them incredibly inspiring, and they're a tremendous encouragement to me in my work each day here at CMDA. By now, I bet you know that at CMDA, we work relentlessly to fulfill our vision statement to bring the hope and healing of Christ to the world through healthcare professionals. As I look at our community of dedicated healthcare professionals and students, I have witnessed some of you going after this vision by serving on a mission trip. Others have been working tirelessly as compassionate advocates for truth and righteousness at the state and federal levels. And some have been using your spiritual and intellectual virtue to craft ethical statements consistent with science together with our biblical worldview. I often marvel at how the Lord has brought together the various gifts and talents of so many to do His work here on earth through CMDA. And that's why I've been asking you, friends, to consider a financial gift. While by God's grace and blessing, CMDA has accomplished much for the sake of the gospel, we still have greater opportunities to reach more with the hope and healing of Christ. As you know by now, the months of May and June is our fiscal year-end giving campaign. Thank you for being patient each week while I've attempted to share why this time of giving is so important to your CMDA. Our final goal this year is $750,000, and we've been blessed by a generous $300,000 matching gift that a group of our CMDA champions put together to inspire every one of us. While we're getting close to claiming all of the matching gift, we still need the help of many to achieve our $750,000 goal. Thank you, friends, for helping to achieve this incredible opportunity. If you've not given, or perhaps you would consider an additional gift to help us exceed our goal, just visit cmda.org/match, or you can call our stewardship team, 888-230-2637. This week, I have the privilege of being joined by Mr. David Kinnaman. He's the CEO of Barna Group, a name that I'm guessing most of you listening are familiar with. It's the leading research and communications company that has been working with churches and Christian nonprofits and businesses for so many years. As a leader, he has overseen thousands of U.S. and global research studies. So I asked him to join us on the podcast to talk about that research and what we need to know as Christians in healthcare. Oh, and be sure to stay tuned after the episode for some important announcements about upcoming events and opportunities that we have in store for you. Well, today on CMDA Matters, I'm guessing that most of you listening have heard of an organization that's 35 years old. And I will say that after the Bible, in terms of references in church, as I sit and hear pastors speak, maybe the Barna Group is referenced more often than, than any other. So that's saying something. Barna has conducted more than 1 million interviews in the course of hundreds of studies and has become a go-to source for organizations that want to better understand a complex and changing world from a faith perspective. And joining me today is none other than their CEO, David Kinnaman. David lives in Fort Worth, Texas, and has 3 children. So welcome to CMDA Matters today, David Kinnaman.
It is great to be with you. Thanks so much for having, and thanks for listening.
So how did you get here? I mean, how did Barna get to the position of being such a trusted source of culturally relevant information for the church, for pastors, for Christian nonprofits or associations like us at CMDA and many others, and to do such a good job at evaluating the various generations and how they view various issues?
The company was founded in 1984, and I think one of the advantages that it had was this sort of first mover positioning, where it was one of the first companies to do research, social research on faith and religion in America. And there weren't too many people doing it. And Gallup was doing some, and every once in a while you'd find a little bit of research, from here and there, sociology, but not a lot. And so I think God helped George and Nancy create kind of an innovative company in a first mover advantage sort of way. And then George Barna was a prolific author, is a prolific author. He's written, I think, 55 or 60 books, something like that. And it really helped set the brand. And he would, travel and speak. A lot of what I did in my early days was support the sort of the home office, while he and his wife and his kids would go and do church conferences. And so I think, they built the brand sort of one city stop at a time, one book at a time, and one topic at a time. And so I think we've had the privilege of looking at a wide range of things through many years. And he also did a good job, I think, of keeping the company from being kind of a one-trick pony. Like when you want data on this one topic or very political topics, you sort of tend to shy away from those things. So again, lots and lots of credit to the founders, to George and Nancy. And then I think God's given us the chance of doing some really fun things in the time since 2009 when I bought it. And, we always are thinking about new generations and new leaders. And some people think we're futurists. We're actually just presentists, which is a lot of us kind of live in the past. Human nature is averse often to change. And so I think the church is often, living 10, 20 years in the past. And so a lot of what we're trying to do is actually just help people live well in the present and at least anticipate where God might be taking us down the track. It's been a real privilege, and it's again, we never take it for granted. I do feel like we have an incredible brand, and we're widely trusted. But there's always new readers and listeners and younger generations of medical professionals and church leaders and others who I think are requiring this kind of cultural faithfulness, how to live faithfully as a Christian in the world, but not of the world.
So what's your current mission and vision statements for Barna under your leadership?
The way we think about it is derived from the First Chronicles 12:32, which is the tribe of Issachar, the people who understood the times and knew what the people of God should do. And I think one of the ways I would then say in the current iteration of how we think about then, how that gets applied is we're orienting more and more in the current and future planning is towards solutions and not just knowing, because I think we're really, really good at understanding the times. If you want to understand millennials or Gen Z, there's not too many companies that could help you understand the faith journeys of younger generations like we do. But we're more and more oriented towards the knowing what to do. And we do that in partnership with other authors and thinkers and idea makers. We want to help create sort of new wineskins. We feel like another biblical metaphor that, that Jesus talks about is the new wineskins. And it's a very powerful idea. And in particular, I'll just read you a quote I actually just came across from followed on my friend Ed Stetzer's social media, but it came from Tim Keller. and he says, this is Tim Keller, a looming crisis for all American evangelical churches is that they cannot thrive outside of the shrinking enclaves of conservative and traditional people and culture. We have not created the new ministry and communication models that will flourish and grow in the coming post-Christian secular Western world. Our vision then should be to develop campus ministries, new churches, Christian education, and discipleship systems that are effective in those fields in North America. And again, that's Tim Keller. So I think understanding the times, knowing what to do, I think part of our mission is expressed by the notion that we want to try to help, facilitate those new models, new ministry ideas, new leaders, new mindsets for the post-Christian world that we live in. And that includes, as we talk about, medical professionals, the incredible efforts that, your tribe, the listeners to this podcast, the roles that we all play as ambassadors for Jesus in our spaces. And, it's not just that quote applies to church institutions, but also applies to the kinds of ways we support leaders across a variety of different sectors.
As you think about Christians in healthcare, medicine, dentistry, and other disciplines within healthcare, are there a couple of studies that stand out to you as being especially cogent for our listening audience?
Well, I think, first of all, we can look at the pandemic, and I think, pastors were kind of frontline workers for people's spirituality, but clearly the reason we have the phrase frontline workers, and that's been so much in our common language the last couple of years, is because of the incredible work and sacrifices and efforts from people in the medical community. For what it's worth, I mean, I've got lots of family members who are in the medical profession. My uncle is a nurse practitioner. I've got others who are in other, kind of medical careers. My two daughters, Emily, she's in medical research. She's a biology major and now works on Alzheimer's research in a lab. And then my daughter, Annika, is a nursing major. She'll be done in a year. So I would talk about the research that reflects on the crisis that people have gone through these last 2-3 years. And now it's appearing to be a kind of spiritual openness. I think all the efforts, God rest those who have been lost in these last 3 years through COVID or other challenges. I've personally gone through a big tragedy with the loss of my wife a few years ago from brain cancer.
I heard that.
And so, we all are physical bodies, and we all have expiration dates, and we all have journeys to take. So I think the pandemic peeled back so many areas of loss and suffering and showed what many medical professionals would sort of understand on a daily basis is the brevity of life, the things that people suffer, the brutality of surgery, for example, to deal with something that's more brutal than the surgical solutions that, are required. And so I think there's been a lot of people's sort of pretenses that have been pulled back. That's not true in every way or among all people, but there's been some, there's a reason why people have come to ask themselves some really hard questions of like, what do they want to do? Where do they want to live? Where do they want to work? And some of the longer term impacts of how COVID and the related disruptions affected even the work from home or how people sort of feel about work itself. So I think there's a ton of things a lot of directions we could go with that, but those are a few thoughts.
What can you talk to our faculty members and our campus advisors who are out there who are working with our students and residents and fellows in terms of vocational discipleship, and how have you seen it at Barna changing over the last, say, 10 years? What do we need to know? Because we want to be raising up. In fact, it's the number one reason people join CMDA in surveys is that they want to be an active part of raising up the next generation of Christians in healthcare.
Wow, that's a cool rationale, isn't it? Well, there's so many things to say about that. And again, I think there's a couple kind of key ideas. First, I, like you, are very encouraged by the younger generation and their mindset. We've been studying millennials. I mean, Barna has actually been studying generations for as long as we've been around. And remember that generations is just a sociological fabrication. So it's not that a person who's 67 today is really all that different than someone who's 27. People are people. And, God's nature doesn't change. Human nature doesn't change. Our need for Jesus in our lives doesn't change based on the person's age or generation. And there are at the same time, some really interesting and shaping influences that affect how people see the world, how they respond to the gospel. And that's, again, part of Barna's mission, is to understand those times, understand those cultural currents in which we're swimming. And so on a sort of a high level, I'm, like you, very encouraged by how smart, how connected, how capable, how in many cases, and I'll say this with just a little bit of an asterisk, but how intellectually honest young people are about the complexities of the world that they see. Simplistic answers don't have traction. And again, to the extent that we don't live in a simple world, they shouldn't. We should describe the world that we see in exactly the clearest and most accurate and truthful ways possible. And then at the same time, I've made this argument that we're growing up in what I call digital Babylon, that we're trying to raise young disciples, or we're trying to pass on elements of faith and faithfulness to a generation that has sort of lost the cultural moorings to Christianity. And again, that's some good news. The end of Christian America, such as we might imagine it, is a good thing when we don't believe that our allegiance is primarily to a country, but it's in fact to Jesus and his kingdom. I think there's some opportunities for us with helping to steer and coach young people and mentor them and be mentored by them, to see the complexity of the world that they're living in, to understand that technology and algorithms are having a huge influence in the way they conceive of what is real. There's a lot of evidence now that social media has a negative effect on young people, especially young girls. And so, just imagine, again, these deep questions of identity and what it means to live a good life, and how much these algorithms are affecting, some of those fundamental questions for people. So how do we really help, be in the mix with young people, with newer generations? And you mentioned this phrase, this idea of vocational discipleship, which to us is one of the critical ways that a group like CMDA and people in specific areas of industry and of our economy can be shaped into people who have the mind of Christ, the fruits of the Spirit in their vocations, and to recognize that we all have a purpose, that God has created us, for spiritual impact in the world. And that's almost certainly going to be through, what we do with our vocations, and to help people connect those dots, to hear and see from others who've been effective and faithful, who are just a few steps up along the path ahead of us, maybe a few decades up ahead of us on the path. And then to recognize that God has called us into those faithful places, and that being Christian, in the medical space is a highly and important one, especially like we talked about earlier, as people are going through, questions of health and well-being, and sometimes mortality, and the fear and the anxiety that comes, and how can we be agents of peace even as we're pursuing our professional calling.
I'd like to segue. What would you share with our listeners, or some prime takeaways about potential candidates for short and long-term missions? And even if it's a little bit of a rehashing from what I have read in your Future of Missions project, what would you share with us?
I think the first thing to remember is that younger generations, because that's part of the point of the study, was to really look at millennials and Gen Z. And so business's mission was a big thread for young people. They want to see, evangelism and other kinds of faith sharing activities connected in with other kind of marketplace activities. So a lot of openness for that, a lot of openness for media and entertainment and technology to be part of the evangelistic and missional efforts of the church when they go overseas. We found that non-white individuals were also very open to missions in ways that were really inspiring, and they have some important questions and concerns about the past of missions and some of the unflattering and sometimes very unchristian history of colonialism and imperialism and other things. So how do we go into societies and into missional contexts where there's a lot of humility, a lot of willingness to learn, a lot of how do we understand and interpret the gospel in this different context? And then a lot of emphasis on raising up indigenous leaders, and not necessarily in this sort of let's find people from one context to move to another. It's not that there was no openness to that, but there is some, question: is there different models for this? And again, I think in relation to our listeners today, medical professionals and medical missions, it's one of the areas where I think younger people have a lot of openness to, because they see that there are tangible needs and tangible medical needs that are being met. And so being a frontline worker in the medical space allows for those very paradoxes. Again, I think part of the way I would say, sort of describe younger people, is that they're a generation of contrast and a generation of paradoxes. It happens to be true that human beings are generations of contrasts and of paradoxes, but young people really feel those things front and center. They feel the push and pull to a greater degree. And so I think medical missions provides one of those areas where, like, if we can be serving to those who have real needs, physical needs, that might give us entree to have conversations around spirituality. Again, I'm taken and impressed by the level of pragmatism that this generation brings, but also their deep need for mentoring and courage and support and cheerleaders, and sort of those of us of a certain age to just continue to equip them. God has raised this generation for its purposes, His purposes in the world, and I think they're going to accomplish it whether we're there supporting them or not. So let's do our very best to help cheer them along the way.
Well, one of my favorite findings in that, of course, as I'm preparing to give a talk, is that the question, what are missionaries doing now and what should they be doing in various areas? And with regard to healthcare missions, the optics of what are missionaries doing now was actually a fairly small percentage of the respondents among teens and young adults. And yet, what should they be doing? I think it was a factor of 3x higher than those who responded that they are doing. So clearly, like you say, pragmatic, meeting people's physical needs is important to those who are potential candidates for us.
And I think we just released a big study called The Open Generation on teenagers around the world. And one of the headlines from that study is the degree to which teenagers see and want to see justice and causes. And they see all this, again, they're young, they have a lot to learn, as we all do. They might be overly optimistic, but there's a real sense that it's not just like, hey, we want to provide, dental assistance to someone in need of that. They look at some of the larger systems of injustice. So recognizing it's a very justice-oriented generation, which has a lot of different expressions in the world, but seeing these as deeply connected. They're exposed. Screens transport us into human suffering in an instantaneous way. You're on social media and you see a shooting within minutes, sometimes hours of something, an event transpired, a huge tragedy, or people suffering in war in Ukraine, for example, or famine. We're transported into people suffering in a very profound way. Issues of race and racial violence. That's part of, I think, what happened with George Floyd was. Of course, we've seen other kinds of suffering, but the nature of that, sort of death on video. And so I think recognizing that, there's been human suffering since the dawn of time, but there has been not this kind of like you're transported to the front door of that. You're standing on the sidewalk watching this take place. And so helping people to have a theology of lament and a way of processing their grief, and for healthcare workers, for sure, recognizing, you've certainly seen this and know this, that there's as you're bedside with people who are in intense suffering and dying and contemplating death, there's a way we have to show up as human beings. And so how do we take our finitude and we bring it to the very feet of Jesus? And in the page of scripture, for me, as I dealt with, brain cancer, my late wife, and all the health issues that she had in those years, and then her eventual terminal diagnosis and then death. There is a kind of how do we find voice in the pages of Psalms or Ecclesiastes or Lamentations? And so I think there's so much we can do within our churches and our communities, and within this association, for example, to have a deeper theology of suffering. We so often prepare younger doctors and nurses and medical professionals for success and how to deal with the physical problems, but how do we deal with the emotional climate, and then the emotional climate that's inside of us as we confront human suffering and frailty and mortality. The deepest truth is that God Himself comes to meet us. He comes to offer us not just comfort, but he offers us himself as comfort. And so I think preparing young people for these extremely complex challenges like racism and violence and war and suffering and famine. I mean, just sort of a parade of horribles. What do we do with what happens in us as we're confronting those things? And that's really the story of this open generation. They've had to look straight in the eye, sort of the grim reaper of the pandemic, the grim reaper of racial injustice, the grim reaper of gun violence on our campuses around the country. Like, so theology, how does our Christian tradition meet the deep need of our moment is one of the reasons why we can trust that God is who he says he is, and also to realize we have deeper resources to throw ourselves to in God himself.
Well, I saved the fun topic for last. I wanted to ask you, from what both you know personally, professionally, as well as from Barna, the view of politics and partisan politics from young people these days, and what should we at CMDA, our members, our listeners, keep in mind when we're interacting with young people with regard to the general topic of politics? First
of all, as I've observed in our role here at Barna, I don't know a single institution that has not found it more difficult to operate and to lead. Single leader who's found it more easier to lead. Everyone we interact with, every organization, every leader has said the last stretch, however you want to measure, 4, 8, 16, 12 years, but certainly our current moment in the social media, and there's a lot of good social research that shows that the American population is further divided. There is factually a greater divide between liberals and conservatives, Republicans and Democrats. You can see sometimes these pictorial ways of seeing that, our country always had different points of view, but at least in our social research recorded history, we're currently very divided, which makes it hard then, I think, for organizations to serve people who interpret words, actions, decisions that any group does then through that lens. And I've felt it at Barna. It's much more difficult to lead from a center position. And I don't even mean that politically. It's just like from a position where we try not to take sides. We're an apolitical organization. So how do you do that? So first of all, let's just acknowledge it's a lot harder. Second, how do we get advisors who can kind of help us hold that firm center? One of my great friends is Barry Corey, is president of Biola, and he has this great phrase, firm centers and soft edges. So how do we hold the firm center of what it is we are uniquely called to do as an organization? That's not the same as a church. Some churches have very different callings than what we as organizations have. It's not the same as some leaders. So even in my work, I think about my position, my political views, my points of view as sometimes overlapping, but not always the same as Barna. And I've had to try to think through some of those kinds of questions. I may be very passionate about a few things or some things or many things, but that doesn't necessarily mean that's one and the same as the company's question. So, maybe even more to the point, issues of abortion, of life, of gender, of human sexuality, they're very, very complicated. And obviously they're not only complicated on their own right and the pastoral and personal implications. And when we're friends with someone or when they're one of our patients, how do we choose to operate as a Christian? But then they're very complicated when it comes to legislative and political and public square questions. And that's one of the things we saw in the research, and we've seen time and time again, is that the best we can do is to see this through at least these different lenses of the personal, what do we think about the friends, the people we know, and the implications? What do we think about the pastoral implications when we're in a congregation or community together? What do we think about the neighborhood and the kind of decisions we make when we're in neighborhoods and communities and schools? What do we think about the political implications of legislation? And then there's the legal considerations in terms of how should our laws be structured in, obviously this issue of trans people, and gender is just a super complicated one in which, I have strong opinions about this and strong theological convictions. And then there's the theological conviction. What's God think about some of these things? I think helping as an organization, getting really clear what are areas of your domain. So for sure, I imagine that CMDA is trying to help people when it comes to the personal and pastoral and community implications of living out the gospel in these complicated questions, to recognize that we live in a much more complicated and divisive area. Like, how are the fruits of the Spirit going to be displayed? And then being clear on, what are your boundaries, what are your firm centers, and what are your soft edges? How will you orient towards the broader culture that we're operating in? It kind of gets back to that Tim Keller quote that not very many institutions have been formed in the crucible of a post-Christian society. We kind of assume everyone would basically agree with us. And when people don't, and when people vociferously disagree with us and believe that we're being bigoted or that we're being unloving or unchristian or whatever, how do we navigate some of those tensions? So, and it's also clear that a lot of younger Christians, they're certainly raising questions around human sexuality, and they're in the throes of being influenced through media and technology and the relationships around them. And they're asking really good, complicated questions of how do we live as human beings in this complicated world. And I'll just wrap up this answer by saying, when I've read and reread the story of Daniel in the Old Testament, I've read it thousands of times because he's been one of my heroes. We could look at some of the ways we've learned that story about his cultural, his prayer life, his fact that his peers Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego don't get thrown into the fiery furnace. And we tell a lot of the story of almost like the courage and convictions that these young men had, the young Hebrews. But if we really read that story carefully, it's both the conviction that is set against their capabilities of being in the world, in the Babylonian world, but not of it. And they learn the language and literature of Babylon. They take on the Babylonian deities' names. They're more Babylonian than the Babylonians. And so in those tensions come the story of their faithfulness. And we like to think about the story of the faithfulness sort of like, kind of in a laboratory, or like look at these guys. You would have always recognized them as the kind of God-fearing people. But I think their stories are much more complicated and much more tension-filled, much more bittersweet. And as a result of that, I think if we saw the younger, well, frankly, all of us, but especially these younger generations, as people are trying to navigate faithfulness in a new Babylon, and in a new kind of place of technological advances and of sort of cultural power and really godlessness, then we would see the story of people who have the courage to stand for their faith in a much more brilliant contrast. And I think that's what inspires me about not only what you guys are doing, but what younger Christians are trying to do. And younger, I think about my two daughters, Emily and Annika, and their faith journeys and their spiritual sensitivities and their own journey of losing their mom to cancer, and then their decisions to pursue medical and science-oriented careers to put things to right. And I'm inspired by that. I want to see more young people alive to God, alive to their purpose, and serving God faithfully in careers of science and medicine, such a huge area of ministry and of care and of faithful presence.
Well, we share in common that we're dads of nurses, or nurses in the making. I have a nurse middle daughter, and my older daughter has just started nursing school last week, so I'm going to have a couple of those in my family.
That's wonderful.
We've been talking with David Kinnaman, CEO of the Barna Group, and God bless you and Barna and all that you're doing, and look forward maybe one of these days to getting you to our national convention.
That'd be a pleasure. Absolutely.
CMDA is excited to continue our partnership with the Hendricks Center at Dallas Theological Seminary to host an annual in-person conference called The Convergence: Critical Conversations for Healthcare and Theology. This year, our topic is how theological and healthcare voices can collaborate to better care for those navigating mental health challenges. Please join us for this critical conversation as we consider the theological, scientific, legal, and pastoral aspects of mental health. You can join us live in Dallas, Texas, or virtually on August 4th through 5th. Registration is now available at cmda.org/events.
Well, this conversation with David from Barna Group was certainly eye-opening for me, and to hear about his own personal tragedy and the lament that he has gone through in the loss of his wife, it made me even more thankful for the work that Barna does to provide tools and research for ministry organizations like CMDA. In its 40-year history, Barna has become a go-to source for insights about faith and culture, leadership and vocation, and generational insights. They have carefully and strategically tracked the role of faith in America, developing one of the nation's most comprehensive databases of spiritual indicators. If you'd like to delve deep into the studies that they have done over the years, and there are many, or if you specifically want to take a look at a couple of the studies that we mentioned in our conversation today, be sure to check out their website by going to barna.com. We've also included a link in our show notes today. As I was talking with David, I was struck by what he shared regarding the focus at Barna to not just know and understand the times we're in, but to know what to do, to actually find solutions for the church to truly grow in today's post-Christian world in America, as well as around the globe, to truly navigate faithfulness in this new Babylon. Just as he shared with us, our need for Jesus just never changes, no matter how much the generations change and evolve, and no matter how much the culture all around us transforms. It's a big part of why we focus so much on mentoring the next generation of healthcare professionals, because we need to find solutions to help prepare the next generations for the very struggles they will face, to help them have a true understanding of what biblical justice is all about, and to encourage them to develop a deeper theology of suffering that David referred to. Several months ago, I was joined by Dr. Darylyn Falk, as well as Reverend Ken Jones and our very own Pastor Bert Jones on the podcast to talk about the importance of mentoring from a coach approach. It's a very novel way of approaching mentoring, and I hope you'll check it out because there's a deep need among CMDA students for mentoring and support. You can find more information from our CMDA Center for Wellbeing. You can go to cmda.org/wellbeing. And if you want to listen to that interview from earlier this year, there's a link in our show notes today so you can listen in.
CMDA's Center for Wellbeing helps Christian healthcare professionals align with God, optimize well-being, and maximize influence. If you find yourself feeling burned out and overwhelmed by your daily demands, please reach out to our team in the Center for Wellbeing. After all, you pour yourself out for others every day, and this is a place to be refilled. Plus, we've been expanding our services in the center to help meet the great needs CMDA members have. You can sign up for certified coaching training courses that prepare you with the skills for coaching those in your sphere of influence. And our team can even help you walk through the difficult challenge of facing a malpractice lawsuit. Plus, we offer marriage enrichment weekends and retreats for our members to refresh and restore their marriages. Our team members have been where you are, and we want to help you through the challenges you face. Visit cmda.org/wellbeing to learn more.
You know, I was struck by how many times David described how complicated our world is. It's not as simple, it seems, as it used to be in previous generations. We're called in these complex times to hold firm to the center of what we're called to do as healthcare professionals, and that's bringing the hope and healing of Christ to our world, no matter the complexities we face. And one of the ways that we do that here at CMDA is through missional opportunities to serve the lost and the last and the least of these with the skills that the Lord has given us as Christians serving in healthcare. If you'd like more information about how you can get connected and learn more about opportunities to serve through CMDA, I want to encourage you to check out our Center for Advancing Healthcare Missions. We call it CAM for short. This part of CMDA's ministry seeks to mobilize and support physicians, dentists, nurses, therapists, and other healthcare personnel to use our professional skills to help people encounter Jesus here in the U.S. and around the world. It's a great place to get started, so visit cmda.org/CAM, CAHM, for more information today.
If you have a heart for missions and you want to learn how to live missionally in your life, in the U.S., or around the globe, then now is the time to register for the 2023 Global Missions Health Conference, known around here as GMHC. This year's event is scheduled for November 9th through 11th at Southeast Christian Church in Louisville, Kentucky. And when you get there, be sure to look for the CMDA neighborhood in the exhibit hall. We'd love to introduce you to all the ways you can use your skills to serve others. Visit cmda.org/events for more information.
I want you to be sure to listen next Thursday for an exciting development in CMDA's work to protect the conscience freedoms of our members all across the country. I'll be joined by my regular co-hosts, Dr. Jeff Barrows and Chris Shandovel, a senior counsel from Alliance Defending Freedom. We're going to share some updates with you on a couple of legal cases that we've been involved in, incredible outcomes, so you don't want to miss it. As always, if you want to suggest a future guest for the podcast, you can email us at cmdamatters@cmda.org. And if you like our podcast, please be sure to give us a 5-star rating and share us on your favorite social media platform. As I close today, let me share one more testimony from another CMDA student member, one who attended the CMDA National Convention earlier this spring. And she said, quote, "I often find myself in the minority in regard to convictions about many divisive topics. It can be difficult when you stop to think about entering a field in which most of your colleagues won't hold the same beliefs. I was refreshed as God reminded me that we don't walk this road alone, and God is actually raising up a mighty army of warriors for his kingdom." Just like Daniel in Babylon, we belong to a shrinking minority in an increasingly secular society that simply doesn't believe the same as we do. Thanks to the work of Barna Group and the ministries of CMDA that are following God's call to step into these arenas, we are being equipped to raise up that mighty army of warriors for the kingdom that the student described. And we are being equipped to truly be able to bring the hope and healing of Christ to our world today. And that's what matters to CMDA. And CMDA matters. We'll see you next week, Lord willing.
This podcast has been a production of the Christian Medical and Dental Associations. The opinions expressed by guests on this podcast are not necessarily endorsed by the Christian Medical and Dental Associations. CMDA is a nonpartisan organization that does not endorse political parties or candidates for public office. The views expressed on this podcast reflect judgments regarding principles and values held by CMDA and its members and are not intended to imply endorsement of any political party or candidate.